Welcome, everyone, and we will get started. My name is Adam Greco, and I will be the moderator here for this SDEC session. Thank you so much for joining. Just a couple housekeeping items before we get started. If you are new to the SDEC or someone forwarded this link to you, check out the chat. I will be posting links if you want to become an official member of the SDEC. And if you do that, you will have access to over 30 of our past webinars for free that you can check out in our SDEC Slack group. I also noticed that we are still missing about 20% of the people who are in the SDEC who are not in the Slack group. So I'm going to be posting my email address. If you are in the SDEC, but for some reason you are not in the Slack group and you haven't been looking at all of the past webinars, just email me at the email address I'll put in the chat, which is just sdec@searchdiscovery.com. And it takes just a minute or two to get into the Slack group. During this presentation, if you have questions for Josh, go ahead and put them in the Zoom Q&A area, not the chat. It's better if you put in the Q&A area, and Josh will get to those questions after he's done with the content. But if you have any other questions about the SDEC or any technical problems, you can ping me in the chat. So with that, I will hand it off to Josh. And just one last thing I want to say is Josh is one of our members, and he's an actual corporate client. So I really appreciate Josh. It's always easy for consultants like us to come in and share stuff, but it's always awesome when we have people on the client side who are doing this. So Josh, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to do this.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. So I'll be talking about the Adobe Analytics bulk data insertion API today, and it's a framework that most customers probably aren't going to be using every day or even every week, but there's a lot of really cool functionality, some really interesting use cases that might apply to the work that you do in the future. So it's relatively new. I think it was launched in late April or early May, and the documentation is great. And it's actually fairly easy to use. So we'll be digging into the details on kind of what it's about and how to use it, and then some potential use cases for you moving forward. So just to cover off on the basics quick. The bulk data insertion API is an Adobe Analytics capability, allowing customers to upload server call data in batches of files, as opposed to using client-side JavaScript or other methodologies for getting data into Adobe Analytics. The server calls in these batch files can be either current live data or historical data. One note there is that as far as loading historical data, they basically just follow the contract data retention policies for you. So if your contract states that you've got 36 months of history, they will allow you to load data up to 36 months old via the bulk data insertion API. And then one other little caveat is that it only works with timestamp enabled or timestamp optional report suites. So that's a potential small change that you might have to enable prior to getting started with this. A lot of you may have used the legacy data insertion, part of the 1.4 API suite from Adobe, and this essentially replaces that. But the legacy data insertion API and the bulk data insertion API are both methods to submit server-side collection data to Adobe Analytics. The biggest difference is that the legacy data insertion API calls are made one event at a time, whereas the bulk data insertion API accepts CSV files that allow you to upload all of your event data one event per row. So instead of making, hundreds or even hundreds of thousands of requests one after another, with this, you can just package one big CSV file and push it up to Adobe that way. So if you have used the legacy data insertion, this might look familiar, where you essentially reconstruct the entire request of a normal client-side JavaScript server call. And then you make a get or a post with all of that formatted data one at a time. Whereas now with bulk data insertion, it's basically one gzipped file that you post to that events endpoint, or it's one file per visitor group. And we'll get into kind of the ins and outs of how the visitor groups work a little bit later. So how does this compare to some of the other capabilities within Adobe Analytics? And it's actually great timing because I know there have been webinars recently on both sync classifications as well as the data sources API. So kind of the way that I look at it is that classification importer is really a single key. It's what I call data hydration, where you might have a lead ID, and then you might package up whether they converted online or via sales, maybe age and gender, and you upload that using the lead ID as the key. Then for data sources, it expands a little bit more. I consider that to be kind of more relational, third-party data. You can use, one or more keys, tracking code or EVARs, and then you can append, whatever events you want to that. The difference here is that the bulk data insertion works really well with traffic type data. Obviously, it benefits from full processing. There are essentially an unlimited number of keys because you can include as many props and or evars as needed in one file. And another nice part is that there's no need to configure anything in the UI. So both classification importer and data sources require you to kind of go through and tell Adobe what to expect when you send the data, as far as just mapping the events, evars, and props. With data insertion, there's nothing to configure. You just send them the file with the appropriate headers, and then they figure out, the mappings on their end from there. So there's some flexibility there in that regard. So now digging into some of the basics as far as how this works if you want to use it. And the first thing we'll go over are the files themselves. So the batch files must be in CSV format and gzip compressed when you actually make the request to Adobe. Each file will have the header row and then all of the subsequent data rows. The header row just defines the columns that will be found in the subsequent data rows. Rows are separated by commas, and if you need a comma inside of an individual field, maybe you have an EVAR that is comma delimited, you can just wrap that entire field in quotes, like in the example there, and then empty lines are ignored. Kind of one of the big decision points, if you do decide to use this, comes with really how frequently you need to upload the data, as well as the size of the data itself. So when you gzip it, those can be up to 100 megabytes, and then the uncompressed file size limit is 1 gigabyte. And there is no restriction on file names. And when we get into some information around how to structure the visitor groups, that's kind of when you need to decide kind of how to set up the files and the best way to batch those. So as far as required columns are concerned, you have to pick at least one of the following fields for user identification. Obviously, the most straightforward is going to be the Marketing Cloud Visitor ID if this is existing Adobe Analytics data that maybe you're just moving from a different report suite or from another account. IP address is acceptable. And then the third one, which is where this starts to get really cool, is if you have some sort of custom ID. You can pass that in there, and then there's a second field that is MCC'd, which would be set to true. And we'll get into that in a little bit, but that's where the functionality of bulk data insertion starts to get really, really cool, when you can start to include data from other systems and other analytic tools and essentially integrate it into your standard Adobe Analytics traffic data. Your file must also contain at least one of the following fields. And I'll just call out right away that Report Suite ID is one of the fields here. So at the very least, you would need MCID, IP address, or some sort of custom ID, and then the report suite. Um, Other acceptable fields there are page URL or page name, the PE parameter, which is the activity map link type field. There's a query string field, and we'll get into this in just a second, but basically you can submit your file two different ways. One is just a standard CSV with individual columns for each data point, or you can actually build out the query strings similar to the way the legacy data insertion works. A timestamp, and they accept two different kinds there. And then user agent is also another option here. So we'll go over the query string type first. So the data files can be structured using the query string field, or it can just use standard column-based formats. So with the query string, similar to the legacy data insertion, where you reconstruct an actual server call with individual fields represented as query string parameters. So then you would basically set that using the query string field in the file, and the data inside the query string must be fully URL encoded, just like you would see if you were to inspect a network request from your website when the data gets sent off to Adobe Analytics. One kind of important part is if a field is set inside of the query string field and it's included as its own column, the query string field actually gets overwritten. So when we use this, we just went with the regular column-based format, and I'm assuming a lot of folks would do that as well. But if you do have automation or some legacy code that you used with the 1.4 API, that should be pretty easily translatable to the new bulk data insertion simply by using that query string field. As you know, the query string is typically prefixed and postfixed with the AQB and AQE parameters, and that just lets them know when the start of the server call is and where it ends, as well as the content encoding. And those are set as defaults if they're not present in the query string. So you can add those. Of course, if you're using some other type of encoding, you would want to set the CE parameter, but just know that those are not required and they will be set as defaults if they're not included. And then one final point there is other required columns, say the report suite ID, the timestamp, or the user agent should not be present in the query string. So just to show you a quick example of that, we've got Marketing Cloud Visitor ID and timestamp as their own fields, but then I've got campaign, JavaScript version, page name, and refer all included as query string parameters, and they are URL encoded. So this is essentially an example of what the file might look like using only the query string field. So then when we talk about just the regular column-based format, it's pretty straightforward. It just uses individual columns for each of the fields. A couple notes there. If a column header is duplicated in a file, only the first instance of the column and its corresponding data fields get used, and then the duplicates are ignored. The column header names are case insensitive. Any headers unrecognized by bulk data insertion will be ignored, and they can appear in any order in the CSV file. So here's a screenshot from an actual file that I had used as part of our use case for bulk data insertion. You can see we've got each of the individual fields in their own column, and no need to URL encode anything else. So a little bit more straightforward and a little bit more simple if you're using the column-based, but the query string version also might have some advantages if you're a user of the legacy API. And then just a quick note on the row order. This is a super important concept. All rows in a batch file for any given visitor must be sorted in chronological order by timestamp from earliest to latest. This ensures that the visitor events represented in the server calls occur in order. Sorting is crucial for proper purchase attribution, analyzing visitor behavior, etc. A lot of the flow type visualizations would be dependent on that. And then just of course, one important note that they call out in the documentation is that Adobe does not guarantee the integrity of data processed by bulk data insertion if this order requirement is not strictly observed. So just super important to keep an eye on that if you are going to try this. So now to get into some of the more advanced concepts. So I'd mentioned this notion of a visitor group, and I'll kind of just explain it and then show what that looks like. So visitor groups allow customers to upload files that can be processed in parallel, thus increasing the overall ingestion throughput. This really only matters when the file size or the record count exceeds the maximum for a single file. So if you recall, compressed 100 meg, uncompressed 1 gig, if you are taking multiple years of history from another system and pushing it into Adobe Analytics, you very well may exceed those limits. So in that case, you would need to spread out the data across multiple files, and that's where the visitor groups start to come in. Basically, if you're going to upload, multiple files. Each file uploaded must be tagged with a visitor group via an HTTP header, and that just tells the system that all of the visitors in this file are only in this file. So if I'm sending 3 files with all of this history, I need to make sure that there's no overlap between visitors in any of those files. And then, one of the benefits also is that each visitor group creates a separate processing pipeline for files associated with that visitor group. So those are allowed to process concurrently with other processing pipelines if you were to send, say, 3 or 4 files at the same time. So what that looks like is here is all of the data ordered by timestamp. You can see it's not ordered by visitor ID, rather by timestamp. But then what they've suggested here is that they split this into 3 different visitor groups, 0, 1, and 2. And you'll see that each visitor group is also ordered by timestamp and not visitor ID, but there's no overlap between visitors in each group. So 3 and 6 here, 1 and 4 here, 2 and 5 here. So this is really the way that you would want to structure it if you did have to do, multiple files, or maybe you're doing, running this once a week and there's multiple files. That's just something to keep an eye on. A couple other considerations as it comes to the visitor groups. One nice thing is that the visitor groups can be changed. So if I run this on Monday and then I need to push an update on Thursday, visitor 3 could get moved to visitor group 1, and visitor 1 could get moved to visitor group 0. Again, as long as there's no overlap between visitors in those groups, you're good to go. And then you just need to make sure that other files have finished processing before submitting any new visitor groups. Per Adobe, the bulk insertion was designed to run optimally with larger file sizes, so they recommend a pattern of larger files uploaded less frequently rather than small files uploaded more frequently. So if you were maybe packaging up, offline events, or you've got data coming off of IoT devices that you wanted to integrate with some of your other regular traffic data, you wouldn't necessarily want that to be live where you're pushing just a couple requests up there at a time. Rather, you might want to wait until the end of the day, package it up as one batch file, and then ship it off that way. And then some other recommendations from Adobe: no ingestion of 2,000 rows per second per visitor group, and no more than 1 API call per second per visitor group. And again, this is really probably for the more heavy users, or people that have use cases that require them to, send bulk data up to Adobe on a daily basis. I would say for the casual user or someone that just wants to import maybe some legacy Google Analytics data, this isn't really going to be as important. And again, if your file size is under 1 GB, then you really don't need to worry about visitor groups at all. So this is where it gets really, really cool, in my opinion. And this is one of the most interesting things that I found with the bulk data insertion API, is that it allows you to generate Experience Cloud IDs or Marketing Cloud IDs via non-Adobe ID seeds. So it basically allows you to take a custom ID and pass it to Adobe, and they will use that as a seed to automatically generate an Experience Cloud Visitor ID. So how this works is you essentially just call out the type here. So you'll see in the documentation, There's a couple fields that are prefixed with customer ID, and then in brackets here, they've got, type, and then there's a couple individual fields. Basically, this customer ID type is completely customizable. It allows you to just put in whatever you want. So in this example, I just used offline email as my customer ID type. And you'll see I've got the ID with a couple email addresses here. And then I use the same name, offline email, here with the is MC seed field. And if you set that to 1, that is true. So then Adobe knows that for these rows where the customer ID type is offline email, we're going to use this as a seed to generate an Experience Cloud Visitor ID. So if I were to just pass this in there, what I would get out is essentially 3 unique visitor IDs or Experience Cloud IDs. So then if you're, doing this regularly with, the same customer set, it'll use the same seed and generate the same Experience Cloud ID for the same emails or whatever ID that you're sending. So tons of use cases and a lot of really, really cool stuff that you can do with this. So then as far as making a request, that's really the easiest part. It was fairly straightforward. I will say, I was doing this back in June, so it had only been out there for a couple months. Did run into a couple little snags, but the customer care folks were really responsive to that, and we were able to figure it out. I will say the issue that took the longest to figure out was actually the simplest, in that it uses the Adobe Identity Management Service to kind of set up the project. So you go to that Adobe console, set up a new project. When we had first started using this, I had an existing project up there, so I was just using the authentication information from that account to use for bulk data insertion. And for whatever reason, it just wouldn't work, even though all of the settings were correct, it had the right permissions, etc. So what they had me do was just create a new project in the Adobe console, and then everything worked fine. So my recommendation would be, if you're going to give this a shot, just set up a brand new project, get a brand new client ID. You can upload your public key, and then you'll have your private key, so you can generate the JSON web token, and then you're good to go. So again, create a new project in the console, enable the Adobe Analytics API. It uses the product profiles that you create inside of the admin console to grant the service account access to the features that are needed for bulk data insertion. I don't know those off the top of my head, but I can go back and find them if anybody is curious which specific permissions need to be granted in order to make this work. And then just like all of the other new 2.0 APIs, it'll use the JSON web token for authentication. So there's a bunch of different ways to do that inside of the Adobe console. They allow you to do that, but and I know I'm always leery of uploading a pub or a private key to a web UI. So you could use Postman, Python, JavaScript, etc. There's all sorts of different ways, both locally and externally, to generate that JSON web token. And then the 3 headers that you'll need are an authorization header, and that's formatted just normally with the word bearer and then a space, and then your JSON web token. There's an X API key field, and that essentially is just the client ID that is given when you create the project in the Adobe console. And then there's the Adobe VGID. So that's the visitor group ID. So even if you are only sending one file, you still need like a dummy visitor group ID header, and that can be anything that you want. And then if you are utilizing, multiple files with multiple visitor groups, then that header just needs to change each request as you send each file up there. And then there's an optional one where you can pass in basically a file ID that you create, but that is optional. So the way it works, there's an endpoint that will allow you to kind of test and validate your file first. They're really only checking for the structure and the formatting of your file. If you accidentally have duplicates in there, or, you made some kind of a mistake during your processing, they're not going to catch those things. But if there's something really malformed or there's an issue with your file, this validate endpoint will give you some pointers on that. And then for processing, you just post the file or files to the appropriate endpoint. There are a couple different regional ones that are listed in the documentation, depending on where you live or where you're sending it from. And then there's a separate monitor status endpoint. So when you send the file to that events endpoint, part of the response will have a file ID. So then you can just clip that file ID and put it at the end of this endpoint, and then it will return basically the status of the file, if it's received, processing, etc. If you did set this key, this header with a custom ID, then that is your file ID that you would send back to do monitoring. And then what's even cooler is that the processing time is under an hour. So regardless of how much data you're sending, most reports become fully available within 20 to 50 minutes. So just a couple quick use cases. This was the one that initially brought me to the bulk data insertion API. So we had a dev launch script mistakenly promoted to production, but it was only in a single subdirectory. So it wasn't enough of an effect to trigger the alerts that we had. And we made some changes after that happened. But basically what had happened was we had a couple weeks worth of production data that had landed in our staging report suite. So, but through using just regular Adobe data feeds, we're able to pull out all the traffic and conversion data, clean that up and prep it, and then push it into production with our bulk data insertion. So this is really all that the request looks like. You've got the endpoint. We've got a dummy visitor group ID, since the file, it was just one single file. Our client ID from the Adobe console, our JSON web token, and then just the file gzipped itself. And that's really it. Then within 50 minutes, we had pretty much all of the data back. There was like 2 or 3 days that we couldn't get back for whatever reason, but you can see that through pulling by data feeds out of staging, we're able to move that into production fairly easily. Another good one could be a Google Analytics migration. So maybe an agency client or a new Adobe Analytics customer wants to import historical GA data into Adobe. You could use the Google Analytics API or BigQuery if they're a premium customer. You could dump the historical data, prep, and pass to Adobe that way. The only problem there is that assumes your historical GA data contains some type of user identifier. So like the Google Analytics client ID, if it was available. I don't think the GA API out of the box allows you to access the Google Analytics client ID as a field, which is why I believe they would have to already be tracking that as like a custom dimension. But you can see I could just set that to is MCC'd, and then this would output 3 unique Experience Cloud IDs as a result of the Google Analytics client ID. Couple other potential applications. So one thing that we use a lot is the SDI Toolkit launch extension. It allows you to create a one-way hash of different identifiers. So sometimes if we've got a form out there that's not directly connected to CRM, through the toolkit, we can generate a SHA-256 hash of the email address in the form field. Then we can pull emails out of CRM and other systems and generate the same hashes, do a merge on the hash, append any metadata or customer data from other internal sources, and then you could package that up and ship it off to Adobe that way. And that kind of comes in where you need to decide if you're going to use classification importer, data sources, or bulk data insertion API. There's pros and cons to both of them, but that's one potential use case that is fairly easy to get set up. Other could be, beacon, IoT, point of sale events. Maybe you're logging offline events or traffic from other devices or systems. And maybe you had a use case where you want to push that into Adobe as actual traffic data. So if you could tell who is who, when they're in the store or at the point of sale, you could, classify that visit as, in store or whatever. Um, so that would also work with this. And then, like we did, you can take whatever you want from one report suite and move it over to a different report suite. So there are maybe a couple different use cases there that would be applicable for you. And then I will say, I know a lot of us have frequently been frustrated sometimes with Adobe's documentation. I will say that this BDIA is really, really well documented. That's just one huge long page. But there's a ton of information out there. If you are going to try this, I would highly recommend just hitting that URL, and it should have all of the information that you need. So that is the presentation.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much. That was awesome. Let's dive into questions. If anyone on the call has questions that they haven't posted, now is a great time to push those in using the Zoom Q&A. So I'll just start from the top and kind of work our way down. Is there a cost associated with using the BDIA? Does it go against your server calls?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it would go against just your normal server call allocation, but provided you're under that limit, there is no additional cost. I will say, as I just was giving a compliment on the documentation, the one thing in the documentation that I was a little bit unclear about is there's a little note in there about like you basically need to tell Adobe how many server calls you're expecting to load as a part of your usage of this API, but there's really no information as far as who to tell and when, and how close to accurate it has to be. So I would just recommend reaching out to customer care or your CSM prior to getting going with this, just to make sure that everything's good to go from their perspective.
Okay, next question. What is your approach to deleting or correcting data that was falsely tracked?
Yeah, that's another really good one. And honestly, kind of toyed around with doing kind of a double presentation here with bulk data insertion. And then there's that new data repair API, because I think those two things would pair really well together. But maybe we'll just have to do a separate session on data repair. So that's something I haven't used myself yet, but that is, that essentially allows you to perform deletes on all of your Adobe Analytics data. So there's obviously a lot of considerations there, but anything that's mistakenly loaded, whether it's bulk data or if it's just straight off of your JavaScript server calls, the data repair API is going to be your best bet for fixing or deleting data.
Okay, so does the bulk data insertion API support customer attributes unlike the old data insertion API?
That is a good question. I actually don't know. I'll have to put that as one to follow up on.
Okay, next one. Um, does is MC seed create a new MC ID exclusively, or can it resolve to an existing MC ID?
It's another really good question. I believe that it would be a brand new one the first time that you do it. So if you're taking, GA data. Now that actually brings up an interesting point, because if you're doing like a migration from maybe GA to Adobe, you could put Adobe and GA on the site at the same time. So then you could get your mapping from the client GA CID to the ECID, in which case you could just upload both of them together with the historical GA data. But as far as using the seed off of a brand new ID, they're not going to be able to like translate that and map it to an existing ECID. But the next time you send that same ID, it will get assigned the same ECID.
Okay, and I don't know if this is related or not, but is MC seed the quote unquote visitor ID or the visit cookie MC ID? I'm wanting to deduplicate unique visitors based on in-house customer ID matching.
Yeah, that one I might need to think about for a little bit. Yeah, I think I'm gonna have to punt on that one.
Okay, yeah, and I'll give you all these questions afterwards in case you want to research or think about it. Um, Next one, would you recommend capturing the Adobe MCID in GA to use as a backup for Adobe so you can import if there's another outage?
Yeah, I think that's another excellent idea. If you are running GA and Adobe in parallel, capture the GA client ID in an EVAR in Adobe Analytics, and then capture the ECID in a custom dimension in GA. And then again, I always recommend that people capture the GA client ID in a custom dimension as well. So then that would give you your kind of mapping translation between GA and Adobe. So yeah, that's a really good idea.
Okay, next one. I think this is the thing. If rows in each file should be in chronological order, does it also apply for files? Should the files, I guess, be in chronological order, just like the rows?
Yeah, good question. From my understanding, that does not matter.
Okay. If we go with the query field approach, does that have any limits of or no of characters? Like on web, the get method gets converted into post.
I would, and again, this is just an assumption, but I would assume that the length limits for bulk data query string field would be the same as the just regular old JavaScript requests coming off of the website. And I don't recall off the top of my head what that limit is, but I do know that you could potentially hit or run into some issues that way. So I would probably follow up with Adobe before.
Okay. Next one, if sending multiple concurrent files, what is the expectation for managing chronology across multiple files? I'm not sure if that's related to one we just talked about.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like the previous one, but again, I don't think it matters the order of the files. It's just the order of the records in each file.
Okay. The next question is, the visitor group concept isn't entirely clear to me. Is it just a way to partition data across multiple files?
Essentially, yes. It has to do more with how Adobe is receiving and processing those files, and it really all goes back to the file size limit. So again, unless you've got files that are over 1 gig, or unless your data is over 1 gig, then it really doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, the whole construct of the visitor group is so that Adobe can efficiently process the data in the way in which that they want. There are obviously some um, improvements. There's some performance upgrades over some of the legacy APIs. So just the whole design of some of the newer 2.0 APIs are a little bit different, but it's meant to be more performant on Adobe's end.
Okay, and one last question here. Can the customer identifier used in the BDIA file be used from the ID syncing for audience manager, or does the ID need to be defined elsewhere in an EVAR?
I would think it's the latter, but I'm not an audience manager user, so I would probably just reach out to Adobe on that one as well.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining. And Josh, thank you so much for sharing your real world wisdom related to this topic. It's awesome to have people who are corporate members presenting. So thanks so much for joining.
Absolutely. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks everyone. We do have another Adobe related session on Thursday about checking your data in real time. So Stuart Schilling is going to be presenting some really cool stuff on Thursday. So if you're in the Adobe world, maybe we'll see you again on Thursday. Thank you so much, everyone.